So we'll start with the fuselage. Some things to note before we break apart the seams is we'll leave the pieces of foam that are within the slots for the elevator, rudder, as well as the servos, because those are all really close to the seams, and we want to keep the strength there when we bend them into place. Okay, so I have the foam pulled out of the grooves for the A and B folds. Now for the seam that goes along the side of the fuselage, I'm just going to take a barbecue skewer with the pointy end and run it down and make that groove able to then bend in on itself. And from the plans, there's the little triangles. Those will be what we use to set that angle. So you can use that to gauge if you need to do a little more in the gap. And when you put these triangle gauges underneath, you want the tip to line up with the fold. So it will stick out more down at the tail end since there's less fuselage width there. So we'll put the hot glue in and hold it like that to get the angle. Okay, so now I'm just going to take the hot glue and force it into the groove, and then we'll hold it to let it cool. And then we'll repeat the process for the other side. So now that we have the two sides glued, you'll see that when we bring it up, we've got that fuselage shape that bows out. Now the servos can be mounted either from the outside, or you could even mount them from the inside going through. If you mount them from the inside, you need to do that before you glue up and close the fuselage. If you mount them on the outside, then you can do that after you have glued the fuselage together. In this case, I'm going to mount the servos on the outside, so we'll go ahead and continue with the fuselage. So the bottom of the fuselage is a B-fold, meaning the sides of the fuselage will go beside the bottom of the fuselage like that. So when we glue this, you want to glue one side at a time and hold it in place, maintaining an equal angle on either side. And you want to hold the top in place temporarily so that you get the correct angle. So we'll just put a bead of glue down one joint and then hold it in place while the glue dries. And then we'll repeat the process for the other side. So before we glue the top of the fuselage, there are some extra pieces that will go on the inside that will reinforce the fuselage, mainly around where the skewers go through for the landing gear and for the wing hold down skewers. So here along the back of the wing, where the two holes are for the skewers, we'll put the extra piece that will reinforce that. When you do that, make sure you put it down. If you do this before you fold it, put it down low enough so the top of the fuselage will be able to go down in there. So these blocks will just help reinforce where the skewers go through for the wing hold down. Make it a little bit stronger. So there's the two rear blocks in. For the landing gear holes, there's this long piece, and we'll put that, it goes right along the bottom there, and it can be flush along the front. For the rear of the fuselage, we'll go ahead and put the glue on both sides and then hold it in place. Make sure you've got enough glue in your hot glue gun before you start this. Okay, now we can glue these two pieces in the front. Okay, so we have the top of the fuselage glued on there. So now we can continue with the reinforcements. So the triangular piece is going to go right behind the windscreen and up against the top cross member there. So we'll go ahead and glue that in place. So when we glue this one in place, we can get it about flush with the front. It doesn't have to be exact, but right around there. The main part of this, the main job of this reinforcement piece is for the skewer that goes across the top for holding the front of the wing. And we'll repeat this on the other side. The last reinforcement piece is this small one that goes across right behind the cross member, and it's just there to provide a glue surface for the poster board that will be the windscreen. So we'll just put a small bead of glue right along the bottom. So now we'll work on the tail feathers. So we've got the horizontal stabilizer cut out. So we can go ahead and crack the joint. Okay, so we've got the hinge line cracked, and we'll go ahead and do a bevel on the elevator. So now we've got the bevel. One thing you'll need to do is clean out where the elevator sides rub on the horizontal stabilizer. So I usually just run an X-Acto knife through that a couple times. And there we go. So we'll do the same thing with the rudder and bevel the edge. We can now prepare the fuselage for the horizontal and vertical stabilizers by completing the cuts on the slots that will accept them. Now go ahead and reinforce the hinge lines on the rudder and elevator. So just a small bead of hot glue. And then scrape most of it off. And then I like to lay it flat while it finally dries. The way the vertical stabilizer attaches to the horizontal stabilizer, we'll fold this flap back and slide the vertical stabilizer on. And then we need to pinch the tab down a little bit. We can now do a trial fit of the tail feathers into the fuselage. Make sure everything lines up properly. Now that we've done a test fit in the fuselage, I'll go ahead and glue the vertical stabilizer to the horizontal stabilizer. And that'll just be a bead right across the top there. And I'll use a square to make sure that they're square to each other. Now we'll just put a bead of glue along the bottom to hold the bottom of the vertical stabilizer in place. You don't need to be too perfect with this glue since it's going to be within the fuselage and not seen anyway. Alright, now we can again just test to fit one more time. And before I glue in the tail feathers, I'm going to go ahead and pop out these blocks for the servos as well as for the tail skid. To glue the tail feathers in, we'll put a small bead of glue in each slot and then slide it together, and then we'll come back and put glue along each side to fill it in the rest of the way. Put a small bead along each side. Clean it up with a little piece of foam. So the servo mounting holes are sized for about a 9-gram servo. You might need to adjust that as needed for your servos. Control horns, those will be mounted in the rudder and elevator as usual. And so I'll go ahead and work on installing the servos now. Also, depending on the length of the leads on your servos, you may need an extension. Here I've got an extension and I tape the connector to make sure it doesn't come apart. I'll glue the servos in place just by pulling them up a little bit and putting a drop of glue under each side. Okay, so I've got both servos glued in place. Now, for the control rods and control horns, and with the rudder control rod, I don't know if you can see it, but there is a slight bend in it right here that helps the geometry work a little better, so it's straight off the control horn and then takes a bend in. So I have my motor mount cut out, and I've got little marks for about where the screw holes will go. So what you want to do is send the wires through the hole and line up the mount on the firewall and attach the motor. Depending on your motor, you may need a relief hole in the middle for the back of the shaft, so you'll need to accommodate for that if needed. For the motor mount, we'll glue that right on the front, and then we'll use extreme packing tape around it to help hold it in place. So we'll wrap the extreme packing tape around the sides and then one piece down the bottom. And because of the angle, it will go up when it folds around the corner. So you can either let it do that, or I like to cut this at an angle. Now with it taped, we'll need to cut the tape around where the holes are. Now for the landing gear, I basically followed the flight test pattern. A piece of wire about 15 inches long with a bend in the middle, more than 90 degrees, and then this length here is about 2 inches from here to here is about 4.5 inches, and the rest of it for the axle on each side. I used hot glue drop to keep the wheels on. And the landing gear will be mounted on the bottom as usual. I'll also add 2 pieces of popsicle stick as a reinforcement to prevent the landing gear from going through the foam or denting the foam. So those will sit on there so the landing gear can then be supported by the popsicle sticks. So I'll just glue these on, put a dab of glue, on the back. So now I'm going to poke the holes for the skewers. Okay, so those are through. So then we'll use a couple rubber bands to hold the landing gear on. So what I like to do is take the rubber band, loop it around the back barbecue skewer. And this is a little hard to stretch it, but you stretch it through the landing gear once, around the other side, and then essentially do the opposite on the way back. So it holds it there, and then the front landing gear, or the front rubber band will help pull it forward. So that should allow the landing gear to pivot on that front popsicle stick and give you some shock absorption. That's the front landing gear. The rear tail skid, we got the triangular shaped piece of tab on the plans. On the slot in the back, and then we'll take a barbecue skewer and put it along the leading edge of that triangle. So I'll cut a piece of barbecue skewer to put along the back of the tail skid. And the next thing we'll do is go ahead and put in our barbecue skewers for the wing mounts. For the windscreen, I'll take a piece of poster board and mark the top, line along the top of the fuselage, and then I'll take a straight edge of some sort and make a fold on that line. And then again, I'll just trace the back of it. And we're going to cut the sides. And so then I can glue that on. It's a little tight to get the motor connectors connected inside the fuselage, so what I have done is brought the ESC wires out through the firewall, connected them to the motor, and then I'll connect it to the battery and receiver and make sure it's spinning in the correct direction before I push the wires through and fully attach the motor to the firewall. So now that the motor, we know it's spinning in the right direction, we can go ahead and push the wires back through the firewall and attach the motor. Got the motor mounted and the rudder and elevator servos mounted. So we can go ahead and connect those to the receiver and tighten the quick links on the servos. Make sure that they're operating properly. Okay, so I have the servos all centered, so I will make sure that the control surface is centered, and then tighten the screw. So in order to get the center of gravity to be correct, we're going to have all the components, electronics, as far forward as possible. So what I like to do to mount the ESC and the receiver and the battery is use Velcro, and I'll put the Velcro on the sides of the fuselage inside in order to mount those components as close to the firewall as possible. For the battery, I usually use a 1600 3S, and again, it'll be as far forward as possible. Now, depending on the screws that you use for your motor mount, they may stick through the back of the firewall, and if your battery is mounted all the way forward, it could be against those screws. So I'll usually put a piece of foam on the back side of the firewall to prevent the screws from penetrating the battery in case of a crash where the battery goes forward. Cut out a piece of foam to fit just behind the firewall. Shape it as you can shape it as you need to fit in there, and I just fit it in there, and it should, if you shape it right, should be able to just stay in there on its own. And then again, the battery can rest against that. And that will prevent those screws from potentially penetrating the battery. And for mounting the battery, again, I'll just use a piece of Velcro. This piece of Velcro I'll put on the lower fuselage as far forward as I can. The battery will go against that. So there's a piece of Velcro mounted in there. Battery. And then just slide in there and then attach to the Velcro. And that's how the fuselage components are mounted. And for the wings, I've got the parts all cut out of foam. And the way this is going to go together is we'll tape the seam and then hot glue it. The two longer spars will be on the top. We've got a piece of paint stir stick that makes up the bottom half of the spar, and then the foam that completes the rest of the wingspan. And then in typical flight test fashion, the wing will be folded over to join the top and the bottom. So we'll get started by taping together the left and right wings. And I like to first tape it from the side where I can see all the cuts, just so I know those are lined up. And I'll just put a couple small pieces to hold it in position. That'll hold it in position. Flip it over and put the piece of tape on the top. Okay, so that is taped, and then I'll just cut the tape on the other side so I can open up the joint and put the glue in. So we'll leave about a ½ inch from the ends and from the hole in the center. And then we'll clean off the excess. Okay, with that dry, piece of tape across the side. And you cut out the tape around the servo wire hole. So on the wing we've got 5 50% score cuts. The center one is for the leading edge, and this one will be the double bevel. The other two on each side will be to make the proper wing shape, and those will take a barbecue skewer and go through those lines to make them a little bit wider, so we can get the correct bend airfoil shape. Okay, so we'll then do the double bevel on the leading edge. Okay, I have the double bevel cut, so we can then work on the other grooves. And there we go. We can see that now with those lines, we're starting to get the airfoil shape. So the way these spars go in here, we want the long ones across the top, and the wood spar will go in the center on the bottom, and then the foam spars to complete the bottom half of the spar will be on the bottom. So we'll go ahead and glue these spars into place, starting with the top. Make sure you don't go all the way to the tip, since the spar doesn't go all the way. It stops even with the bottom side. And then we'll do that on the other side. Now for the wood spar, this one you can make it as long as you want. This one's about 10 inches long, and then the foam, cut that to fit the rest of the length of the wing. And make sure you have it centered when you hold it down while it dries. So we've got the spars glued on there, and we can start to make sure that the wing is going to fold down properly. If you need to open up the groove a little more for the leading edge double bevel or the grooves that are along the sides of the spars, you can do that now. Make sure it'll fold properly. And the goal is to have the top and bottom spars touching and the trailing edge of the bottom half of the wing lined up. So you can just gently work it in place until it does that properly. There we go. And then finally, before we complete this, I'll go ahead and pop out the holes for the servos. Again, size the holes as needed to fit your specific servos. So we got to put quite a bit of glue down at one time, so make sure your glue gun has enough glue in it. And I have an extra stick standing by if needed. And really make sure you get a lot of glue right there where the wood spar is, since it is a little bit shorter or not quite as tall as the foam. So I'm making sure that the trailing edge is right along the seam for the ailerons, and the spar is right along, and they're lined up with one another. And the last part is we've got to get glue along the trailing edge. So we'll put glue right along the edge there. You don't need a lot, but enough to make contact, and then we'll hold that into place. To reinforce the trailing edge where the rubber bands will go through for holding the wing on, I like to use a barbecue skewer. And when I put this on here and size it, you don't want it to touch the ailerons because then they'll bind. So bring it just slightly off, maybe a 1/16 or 1/8 of an inch on each end. Put a bead of glue, don't get it too close to the ailerons. Hold the stick, the barbecue skewer in place, and scrape off any excess glue. Work on the ailerons now, so we'll go ahead and crack the joint. Okay, we have the bevels cut for the ailerons. And so we'll go ahead and reinforce those again with hot glue, like we did for the rudder elevator. Now we'll mount the servos. These are some really old servos that I had laying around, but any 5 gram or 9 gram servo should work. So what you'll need to do is fish the servo line into a hole and then out the hole in the center. And mount the servo in there. I put a zip tie just around the servo ends to keep them from falling back in there. It doesn't have to be tight, just enough to keep it from coming off. So I have the relief marks for the control horns cut out. The control horns that I use are just gift cards that I've cut up and then colored with a Sharpie marker. These have been used before. Just recycle them out of old airplanes. And just press them into place, and then we'll make sure they fit, and then glue them in. Okay, the wing is complete. Servos, control horns are all connected. For the aileron connections, I use a Y connector. That way I can keep that connected to the receiver and then just connect the 2 cables to the servos and just tighten them up. So the control surfaces are all set up. Because they are so large, you will probably want to dial in expo and maybe reduce the rates as needed. The wing mount, you want the leading edge of the wing to be just slightly above the front part of the fuselage there. You may need to adjust and trim the actual wing saddle where it sits on the fuselage to get a nice tight fit. Once you have that, you can mount the wing can be held on with rubber bands, and then you're ready to fly.